been a little while. I read your book, I think 10 years ago. And if I remember correctly, especially speaking of Robert Monroe, you were able to have out of body experiences. And if I remember correctly, you went to other realities in different time periods. And I believe there, I know we talk about evil, but I believe you mentioned that there are other realities, other dimensions, if you will, some of which are vastly different from ours. In fact,
Mhm.
I think I remember one was being pure evil, and there were other ones that were, you talk about this idea of the intestinal tract, this element that it cannot
Mhm.
understand the bigger play, right? And I think about that in terms of a mosquito trying to understand what Isaac Newton was doing. Like the disparity is so vast we can't even comprehend it. So with that said, going back to what I was saying a moment ago, could you describe what some of these other dimensions are like? And is it difficult based on your limited or maybe not understanding of reality to even glimpse and understand what these other dimensions are like? So question one, what are they like and how can you begin to understand them and by extension other people as well?
Okay. Well, first, I have to give you a little context, and that is you have consciousness, that's fundamental. Everything else is virtual. Everything else is a creation of consciousness. Just like this reality we call the physical universe, that's a virtual reality computed in consciousness. When you die, when your avatar dies, you never die. You're a piece of consciousness. You're immortal. But when your avatar dies, your awareness ends up in a different reality. I call that the transition reality. It's a reality for you to make the transition from making all the choices for a human to back to a piece of consciousness again, seeing existence through a different lens. So all of these realities are virtual realities created and computed in consciousness. Now, there are many such realities. Some of them have a very tight rule set, which is like ours. So by tight rule set, I mean that the rules of a virtual reality, well, let me back up. A virtual reality is nothing but rules. It's basically within this space, we'll call a virtual reality. Here are the rules. Here's how things interact. Here's what you can do. Here's all the possible interactions. Now, those interactions can be very loosely defined, like in a night dream, where you can teleport and you can fly and you can do all sorts of things that you can't do here. Or that could be a very tight rule set that defines every energy exchange is defined, you see, by the rules. Now, what are the rules? Well, that's what we call physics and chemistry and biology. It's
Yeah.
what scientists do. They dig out the rules. So these virtual realities are just rule sets that define what the virtual reality is, what can be done there, and there are many. There are some that are like ours, that are not ours. Something other than our physical universe is out there. And for the beings that live there, they think their reality is the physical universe too. But it's just another virtual reality. It's like you have World of Warcraft and you have The Sims, two different virtual realities. Now, and generally, you can't take your elf out of the World of Warcraft and go over and walk down the street in The Sims land. Those two aren't connected. But if you are on good terms with the larger consciousness system, which is computing and serving these realities, the system can insinuate you into that system. In other words, you become part of the data stream in that other system, and then you can actually be there. You can walk where they walk, you can see what they see, you can shake hands, you can kiss, you can hug. You're part of them. But it's a little awkward in that you have to appear where nobody else is, and you have to leave pretty much where nobody else is because the system won't give you the authority and help you do that if you're going to create anomalies.
Mm.
You have to play the game according to the system. You don't want to create a bunch of anomalies. You wouldn't want just to appear in the middle of a crowd of people or disappear just after you caused a riot. That sort of thing would not be acceptable, and your traveling pass would be revoked. The system would no longer do that for you. But if you've got a good working relationship with the system, you can end up in other realities that are very much like this one, other universes, but it's not this one, it's different. And many of the times the characters in them are similar to us here. Most of the time, they're more behind us than ahead of us as far as their own growth in quality of consciousness. Another way of traveling is just with information. So you can be part of another virtual reality and just be able to view it, see it. You know, like you were a ghost there. Nobody can see you, but you can see and you can communicate mind to mind with people in that reality. But you see them, but they don't see you. So that way it's just a mind-to-mind connection, really, with those individuals and what they're doing, and you could talk with them, but you don't have a physical in quotes. You don't have a physical body there. So yeah, there are lots of things. There are many entities out there who have never heard of this virtual reality, you know, that we call our physical universe, where soul is the sun and earth circles around the sun and has all these humans on it. So there's many that have never heard of us. And how do you get there? How do you travel there? Well, first is by invitation. If you don't know it exists and you don't have an address, then you can't get there without an address. You have to know that someplace exists before you can go there. You know, you can't go to a place that you don't know exists. So I got to these places because the larger consciousness system was training me to understand the nature of reality. So it would take me places, give me jobs sometimes in these various places where I had to not only see it once or twice, but had to keep going there on a routine because I had a job there. So I was being taught about reality and the nature of reality and how it worked from a pretty young age. So the system did that. Now, I think you can just ask the system to do that if you are going to play nice, if you have a good reason, if you're just learning. If you just want to play, oh, I just love to go romp in some of the reality, the system isn't going to pay you any attention because that's not the point. The point is to evolve the quality of consciousness because an information system evolves by lowering its entropy. And in a social system, lowering entropy means becoming love, caring, cooperative. So by us becoming cooperative, we lower our entropy. Our is consciousness. And as our entropy lowers, the entropy of the whole system lowers because we're just parts of the system. So we have this whole consciousness thing evolving. And part of that evolution is individuated units of consciousness like us. And we're part of the system strategy for its own evolution.
Well, I think that if we have time, I'd like to talk about theological implications, but I would imagine that when you have related this to other people, you get considerable pushback. But let's put that aside for just a moment. I want to go back. I don't know if you've ever read Star Maker by Olaf Stapledon, but as you described that, I feel like he must have had an experience like you did to write that sci-fi novel. But that said, for just a moment, I have to ask, and I've always was curious since I read your book. I mean, could you describe a few of these other far out examples of other dimensions? Because I mean, it boggles my mind to even contemplate what that could look like. I think about that. I think the book is called Flatland, you know, when it talks about a 2-dimension versus 3-dimensional. What are some of these other dimensions like?
Well, don't think of them so much as other dimensions as just other virtual realities. Okay, the system is not interested in putting all of its eggs in one basket. Okay, this 9 billion of us here on Earth, that's a lot of seats in this virtual reality. But it's not going to have its entire evolutionary potential in one experiment, one setup, one virtual reality. So there's lots of others. So that's why there's multiple virtual realities. It's just the system is playing in a lot of different games. These games are sometimes very simplistic. The rule sets are very simple. And sometimes they're as complicated as this one that we're in. This one is complicated because, like I said, it's got a very tight rule set that determines every energy exchange that takes place. So what are they like? Well, in general, I don't talk too much about that. I will say a little. I'll give you something on that. But in general, I don't talk about it because whenever you say things that are outside of your listener's experience base, it causes a problem for your listener. They get put in the position of either believing it or not believing it. Or that's where most people will go. Or if they're a little wiser, just leaving it somewhere in the middle, like, well, I give it a 50-50. But most people will feel like they have to believe it or disbelieve it. And if it's not in their own experience, then they can't believe it. They don't have any information out of their own experience to verify any of it. So it just sounds crazy. It isn't useful. And in one way, it's worse than not useful. It's actually detrimental. Because as I describe these other realities and what it's like and what I've experienced, other people will think that that's the way it is. So it's like if I describe Chicago and the tall buildings and the planetarium and the lake and that sort of thing, people will have a good idea maybe of what Chicago's like. Okay, but if I describe something that is totally outside of your awareness, something that you really can't relate to, then it just makes me sound crazy, because there's no way that you can make sense of it or validate it or anything else about it. So it just becomes entertaining, and it's not really very useful. But I will tell you that most of the other reality frames that have tight rule sets that I've been in are sort of similar to ours, but at different stages. In other words, they have humanoid-like things like us, and they do things like we do. They build, they have houses and their own science, their own engineering. They construct, they build. So it's sort of like us. And of course, all of these various realities all have the same point, and that is you experience, you do things, you make choices. That creates experience. You make choices, creates experience. And having those experiences, making those choices, either evolves you to a higher level of consciousness or de-evolves you. If those choices are toward love and caring and support and positive things, then you evolve. If they're between, if it's about fear and control and power and force, ego, beliefs, then you de-evolve. So all of them give choices. And it's not just us humans, dogs and cats, they're conscious. They have choices to make. They can make choices. They just have a much smaller decision space. What I call decision space is all the choices that you might have. Or I shouldn't say it that way, all the choices that you can think of that you have. Mm-hmm. You may really have 50 choices, but you can only see 10 of them. The other 40 are outside of your ability to recognize as actual choices. So those 10 that you can see, that makes up your decision space. That's the space of the choices that you can make. So dogs and cats have much smaller decision spaces than humans. Humans can affect and do so much more, so many different kinds of choices that those animals don't have. And that's true of humans as well. If you go back 10,000 years, the choice set of most people was also very small. Maybe not all that much bigger than than an advanced dog or cat. There wasn't a lot of choices. Today, humans have a huge array of choices, things they can do, get involved in or not, things to interact with or not. So by all of those choices makes a much richer learning environment where you'll grow a lot faster. So the whole learning environment grows. So you go back to 10,000 years ago. Well, 10,000 years ago, people had fewer choices. They were mostly just trying to survive, find some place to sleep, something to eat, to get in out of the cold. They were just trying to get by, live. That was the key thing. Well, there wasn't a whole lot of growth there. They didn't get themselves up to the point yet where their choices were so much growth enabling. So what happens is that a society and as a culture and group of people grow, their ability to make meaningful choices, meaningful mean lowering their entropy, growth choices, gets better and better and better as the whole thing grows. So it accelerates. So now we're making we're making faster strides in our potential to grow up in the last, 100 years than were made in the 500 years before that. And the 500 years before that made a lot more growth than the 10,000 years before that. So growth accelerates. So it's going on at different levels in each of these virtual realities. It is just wherever they are. And as you mentioned, some places I've been have obviously de-evolved to the point that there's hardly anything else there other than chaos. It's an extremely violent and chaotic place. And there, the rebels are little communities of people who are nice, who are polite and caring. And there's little pockets of these pockets of positivity that exist there. And they're hunted down, just like in the movies. So that's kind of at one extreme. And between that and you don't find many extremes on the upside where almost everybody is full of love and joy and peace and everybody's positive. That is very difficult to find. That doesn't happen very often. It's hard to get there because you have to get all of us there. All 9 million of us, or 9 billion of us, have to grow up. Otherwise, you have these very dysfunctional segments of your society. So most of the time, I find them not quite as evolved as we are here. And their technology is not quite as evolved. Sometimes the beings there are very different. There was one place I went that the beings were almost conical shaped. They were like cones with round bottoms, and they had a way of kind of wiggling on that cone for getting around, and most of their communications was all telepathic. I visited there 2 or 3 times, but I didn't spend enough time there to know the details, like how do they reproduce? What did they eat? I didn't get that much detail out of it, but they were social and had interactions and were netted just like we are. They lived in communities. So sometimes the body is unusual because that's just what happened to evolve in whatever the constraints were in that virtual reality that they evolved in. So some of it's very strange. Most of it's not that strange. And the reason I think that most of it is not that strange isn't just because that's all I know, so that's what I create in my mind, but because it's very difficult to make a virtual reality at that scale and that detail. It's not an easy thing to do. Like for instance, one of the things that my model explains is this anthropomorphic paradox, something like that. It's that there are like 5 cosmic constants. Gravity's one of those, that there's gravity, and that's effective all over the universe. And there's a couple of others of these constants that represent the universe as it is. And the scientists have come to the conclusion that if any of those constants change their value, even in like the 9th decimal place, the whole universe would go unstable. In other words, all these constants are just tuned to each other. They all have to be exactly the way they are in order for the thing to work and persist for as long as it has. And basically what happened was that they said it looks like these numbers were all picked and tuned to each other. But that's a conflict with science because science says everything happens randomly. You just happen to have things run into each other. You have new suns created. You have this universe, and it's all just random. There's no guiding hand out there making things work together. It's all just random. And of course, it's 1 in a couple of trillion that you could have 5 numbers all be tuned perfectly to each other, to 9 decimal places randomly. randomly, that just doesn't happen. That's probably 10 to the minus 50, or something as a probability. So it looks like that there's some design here. And that, I think, is where this intelligent design, idea got started, and then it morphed into its own kind of a thing. Ended up getting some religious overtones or whatever. But anyway, that's where that comes from. Well, my model says why. Well, the way you create a virtual reality is you come up with a set of initial conditions and a rule set. You punch the run button, and the initial conditions change according to the rule set. It's that simple. The rule set turns out now to be our physics. And the initial conditions are that ball of plasma, very small dot, high pressure, high temperature, and when the run button is hit, it expands because of the heat and the pressure, and it cools and forms suns, and suns create planets, and things run into each other and break into pieces and so on. So that's the Big Bang Theory, except this is a big digital bang. It all takes place in a computer. All right, and because of that, you have Big Bang, take one. Oh, that only lasted for 3 seconds before it disintegrated. Big Bang, take two. Big Bang, take 10,000. Okay, we finally got everything tuned just right. You see, so that's why you have these numbers that are tuned. It's because it was a controlled experiment, if you will, and the numbers, through trial and error, were tuned to each other to make a virtual reality that was that would last long enough to create avatars that were useful. So you ask me, why? Well, you didn't. I said that these realities are often very similar in the sense that they have gravity and they have trees and bushes and people like things. Not exactly like humans, but something close enough. And the reason is that when you get a system that works, where you can get a reality to be stable enough to produce life like we experience it here on Earth, that is a very carefully selected initial conditions and rule sets. It's not like you can just make a dozen different things. There's only a few things that will work that well at that extent. And if you're going to make another virtual reality, well, you build that one off the one that you got to work. You use a lot of the same ideas, and in the same way, you just you put different things there. Different things evolve because there's difference in the initial conditions. So you end up with virtual realities that are different, but for the most part similar as far as in the way they work, because that works. And it's not easy to just change things and say, well, let's turn gravity in half and see what that makes. Well, it doesn't make anything. It all flies apart and nothing happens, so.
When you say that, when you liken it to a video game, it seems to me that there is something outside of the simulation, something creating it.
Mhm.
And I wanted to ask you, you talk about this idea of the big cheese as an entity, and I don't know if that
Mhm.
is part of this, but what is there, maybe cosmology is the right word, I'm not sure, but what is creating the framework of that Big Bang? What is outside of the system is creating it that allows us to participate in it?
That thing is consciousness, the larger consciousness system. And in my model, I let that evolve from the simplest piece of awareness that you can get, something that's aware that it can be in state A or state B, binary awareness. And if you take that as the simplest form of consciousness, something that's aware of itself and can be this way or that way, then you can let that evolve. And just through the natural logical process that the evolution would have to take, you end up with a larger consciousness system. IUOCs, free will awareness units, all that stuff just are logically required. It's not that I make them up because they could work that way, but this model is developed because logically it has to develop that way. If you look at the logic, there isn't a lot of ways that you can succeed with this. So you start with consciousness. Consciousness is the source of all those virtual realities. Consciousness searching for different types and kinds of entropy reduction trainers for its for its subsets so that it will evolve rather than de-evolve. De-evolve ends up in death. If your entropy goes up and up to where it hits its maximum, then all the bits in the system are random, and there is no information. So you constantly need to evolve. So there's nothing behind consciousness. There's nothing that we know of or that we can think of that creates the consciousness. Now we can come up with some hand-waving conjecture, and I've done that, and actually the results I came to were very much in consonance with the results that I read in Stanford. If you go to Stanford philosophy department and look up cellular automata, and you'll find within that group talking about consciousness. And they take these two ideas. One is that if a system has potential, it'll realize that potential eventually, or that potential can be realized eventually, if you wait long enough. If it has the potential to be realized, eventually will be. That's one thing, and that's got its own name. And then there's the cellular automata that says if you have a rule set, even a simple rule set, and you populate your world with things that can interact, then those interactions can feed themselves and go on and on and on and carry information forward and evolve, and you can have a live thing. So you take those two together and you have kind of the birth of consciousness out of chaos, just because there was potential. But then you can say, well, where'd that potential come from? And again, we don't know. That's kind of outside of our ability to assess on any first-hand basis.
Thank you.
You have more power than you think. Hi, this is Donna from MBT Events. I have had the privilege to work with Tom Campbell for nearly 20 years now, and I can tell you from the feedback received through all those years that he has improved and changed thousands of lives with his My Big Toe theory. As a physicist and explorer of the larger reality, Tom has developed a program where you can learn to access and develop your natural ability as consciousness. His expertly crafted binaural beats are included. Details are in the description below. Thank you.
I and MBT Events hope you like this video. If you do, then you should consider being a Patreon member, because Patreon members get early access to our special content. You will also be able to get your questions answered by me in special Q&A sessions, and most importantly, your contribution as a patron member will enable us to produce the content that you're looking for. So thank you.